My family abandoned me on a deserted island during our vacation, just because I wasn't the perfect child. They thought I would break, but what they didn't expect was that moment would change my life, and they would pay for it in a way they never saw coming. It was late evening in Boston. The city lights were starting to twinkle outside the skyscraper windows as I sat on the 33rd floor, the only one left in the investment department. Everyone else had already gone home, but there I was, still hunched over my laptop, finishing a report that wasn't due until next week. Still working late? Linda, one of my colleagues, peeked her head in. Who are you trying to impress? I smiled faintly without looking up. Force of habit. I wasn't flashy, brown hair cut at my shoulders, light makeup, grey blazer. But behind the plain appearance, I had a sharp mind. My analysis reports had brought in millions for the firm over the past year, but no one in my family had ever asked about them. They probably didn't even know. My phone buzzed. Mom appeared on the screen. I glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m., right on schedule. Still at the office? My mother's voice rang with that familiar disapproval. Don't forget, I'm picking you up the day after tomorrow for the Florida trip. Tracy's already here. She and your father were just talking about your new apartment. They're wondering if moving out was a waste of money. I closed my eyes and counted to 3. My apartment is perfectly fine. I bought it with my own salary. Yes, but Tracy already had a townhouse at your age. There it was, her name. Tracy, my younger sister, the Harvard law graduate, the star attorney, the daughter everyone adored. My achievements, no matter how significant, had always been dimmed next to hers. Mum, I really have to finish something, I said calmly, but she was already on to the next topic. Have you seen your father's new yacht? He posted it on Instagram. It's gorgeous. We're taking it on this trip. I sighed as I hung up. From the outside, we were the perfect family. My father, Robert Bennett, was the CEO of a massive real estate development company. My mother, Evelyn, hosted charity galas and was on the boards of half the city's nonprofits. We lived in a beautiful home. We had wealth, status, and picture-perfect daughters. But inside that perfect picture, I had always felt like a shadow, the forgotten daughter. Growing up, I heard one sentence more than any other. Why can't you be more like Tracy? Tracy was brilliant, charming, naturally gifted. I, on the other hand, had to work twice as hard just to be noticed, and even then I rarely was. Now, as I stared out over Boston's skyline, I thought about the trip I'd be taking in 2 days. A week on a yacht with my family sounded glamorous, until you realized what it really meant. Being trapped in close quarters, ignored, compared, and subtly cut down at every turn. Every year, I came back more emotionally drained than before. But this year, I was determined to be different. I picked up a coffee on the way home and returned to the apartment I had proudly bought on my own. It was small but mine, quiet but peaceful. And I whispered to myself, this year, I won't let them get to me. Just as I was setting down my bag, another message popped up. It was from Dad. Don't forget to pack something formal. I'm meeting some important clients in the Keys. Tracy's putting together a presentation. Of course she was. I stared at the message, my expression hardening. It wasn't even surprising anymore. Tracy was the center of attention, again. And me, just the extra luggage. But what they didn't know was that this year, I wasn't walking into this trip unarmed. I had a plan, not for revenge, but for revelation. If they were going to treat me like I was invisible, then I'd make sure my presence would be something they could never ignore again. The Florida sun was already burning hot by the time I arrived at the private marina in Key West. My suitcase dragged behind me as I rushed down the dock, eyes fixed on the gleaming white yacht, Sea Lion, my father's newest toy. You're late, my mother said the moment she spotted me. She looked every bit the elegant vacationer, white linen dress, oversized sun hat, and that familiar tone of mild disapproval. Morning, sis. Tracy waved from the upper deck, already reclined on a lounge chair in her bikini, sunglasses on, drink in hand. "We've been waiting for like 30 minutes. My flight was delayed," I explained quickly. The truth? My flight was fine, but I'd spent 40 minutes dealing with a ridiculous car rental issue at the airport. My father didn't even look up from the controls. "Good. Now put your bag below. We're leaving." "No, glad you made it." "No, how are you?" "Just instructions." Like always. I carried my own luggage to the cabin while the others remained comfortably on deck. My stomach twisted. Not from seasickness, but from the weight of familiarity. I already knew how this trip would go. It would be Tracy's victory tour. I would be the invisible sibling. At breakfast the next day, my father made an announcement. Over a plate of omelettes and fruit, he beamed. "We'll be spending most of our trip on a little island nearby. Private beach, no one else around. It's a place I rent out for clients sometimes." Tracy clapped her hands. "To celebrate my win in the Millennium Tech case, right, Dad?" I nodded silently, sipping my coffee. "Congrats," I said, though I, too, had just led a major investment initiative that earned my firm millions. Not that anyone here would ever ask. My mum turned to me with her signature half-smile. "Still at that little investment firm?" "It's not that little, Mom. In Boston, it's—" "Ben Crawford invited me to dinner next weekend," Tracy interrupted. "You know, the hedge fund guy." The table's attention immediately shifted to her. My voice evaporated. As usual. Later that afternoon, we docked near the island. It was as beautiful as my father described. Powdery white sands, clear turquoise water, and a dense line of tropical trees in the distance. As we stepped onto the beach, my mother clapped her hands like a cruise director. "Let's set up for the picnic. Tracy, help me with the umbrella. Claire, can you carry the food and the cooler?" Of course. I hauled the heavy items across the sand while the others picked spots, fluffed towels, and chatted. Sweat poured down my back, but no one noticed. I was the worker bee, the helper. When I asked if the setup was okay, my mum looked around critically. "The tablecloth is crooked," and put the drinks more in the shade. I adjusted everything, then sat quietly through lunch, lobster salad, fruit, champagne. The conversation revolved around Tracy's cases, Dad's new yacht contacts, and charity events Mum was planning. Then, out of nowhere, my mum turned to me. "Claire, have you thought about marriage? You're 32. At your age, I was already pregnant with you." I gripped my wine glass. "I'm focused on my career right now, Mom." "Well, men your age are harder to find. You should be more like Tracy, proactive." Tracy smirked. "You can come to one of my firm's parties. Plenty of single lawyers." "If anyone would even want someone like me," I muttered. "That attitude is why you're still alone," my mum sighed. I stood up, cheeks burning. "I'm going for a walk." No one stopped me. Of course not. The forest on the island was surprisingly quiet. I found a small clearing surrounded by palm trees, where I sat down and leaned against a rock. My legs were tired, my heart even more so. "When will they ever see me?" I whispered. Sunlight filtered through the leaves. I closed my eyes just for a moment. Just a quick rest. But when I opened them again, the light had shifted. Evening. Panicked, I jumped to my feet and ran toward the beach. What I saw stopped me cold. The boat was leaving. My mother, father, and Tracy were already aboard, the picnic packed up. The motor was starting. "Wait!" I screamed, stumbling across the sand. "You're leaving me!" They turned. Tracy stifled a laugh. My mother looked unsure. "And my father?" He grinned. "Finally awake, just a little joke," he shouted, not moving. "Dad, this isn't funny." "You'll remember this forever," he called back. "It's only 500 meters. You can swim." Tracy revved the boat's engine. My mum hesitated. "Are you sure?" "She's an adult," my father replied calmly. "Let her have a little adventure." The boat pulled away. I dropped to my knees, the sand burning against my skin. They were actually leaving me. This wasn't a joke. I stood and waved desperately. "Come back," I cried. "This isn't funny." But they were gone. Gone. And I was alone. On an island I didn't know, no signal, no help, just me, and the sinking realization. They really weren't coming back. I sat there for a long time, frozen in disbelief, staring at the spot where the boat had disappeared into the horizon. The ocean looked so calm, so beautiful, and so merciless. The sky was slowly darkening. The shadows from the palm trees stretched longer across the sand, and the reality of my situation sank in. They weren't coming back. I pulled out my phone. No service, not even a single bar. I tried to call. Nothing. I sent a text. It failed. I stood up and screamed into the empty air, "This isn't funny! Come back!" Only the wind answered me. My throat tightened. I started to shake, first from fury, then from fear. This has to be a prank, I told myself. Any minute now they'll return, laughing like it's some big joke. But the minutes kept ticking. The sun dipped lower. They were really gone. I scanned the area. There wasn't much left from the picnic, just a crumpled tablecloth, half a bottle of wine, and a few scraps of food in a plastic container. 3 bottles of water. That was it. I gathered everything and carried it to the edge of the forest where the sand met the trees. I needed shelter for the night. The air was already turning cooler. I wrapped the tablecloth around myself, sat down under a palm tree and hugged my knees. The sound of the waves became louder in the dark. Every rustling leaf made me jump. My mind spiraled through every worst-case scenario. Wild animals, dehydration, injury, madness. Was this really how my life was going to end? I had tried so hard to be a good daughter. Good grades, good college, solid job. I never broke the rules, never asked for more than I deserved. And yet, it was never enough. Tracy always had their full attention, no matter what I did. But even with all the pain, I had never imagined this. Abandonment. Not metaphorically, literally. I barely slept that night. The damp ground, the biting wind, the eerie silence, it all worked against me. Every time I drifted off, a sudden noise jolted me awake. I kept seeing their faces, especially my father's smug grin. By morning, my body was sore and cold, but my mind was sharper than ever. If they weren't going to come back, then I would survive. I stood up and dusted myself off. "Let's figure this out," I whispered. I started exploring the island. It wasn't huge, but it was bigger than I'd thought. A narrow forest stretched through the centre, with sandy beaches on opposite ends. It took me about an hour to walk around the perimeter. No houses, no cabins, no boats, no sign of human life. But I did find something useful. Coconut trees. I threw stones at one until a green coconut fell. I cracked it open with a rock, spilling sweet water into my hands. It tasted like heaven. At least I wouldn't die of thirst. I gathered a few more and stashed them near the tree line. Then I climbed the highest point on the island, a rocky hill near the centre, and tied the tablecloth to a branch, forming a makeshift flag. Maybe a passing boat would notice. All afternoon I watched the horizon, praying for movement. Nothing. As the sun set, I returned to the beach and ventured into the shallow water. I was never much of a swimmer, but I tried catching small fish with my bare hands. After a dozen failed attempts, I caught one. I ate it raw. The taste was awful, but the hunger in my stomach didn't care. That night, as I sat cross-legged by the tree line, sipping the last of my water and chewing on coconut flesh, a strange resolve settled over me. They had left me, but I wouldn't let them destroy me. Not this time. I whispered into the dark, "You wanted me to disappear. But when I come back, you'll have no choice but to see me." It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about survival. And maybe, just maybe, transformation. By the second afternoon, the sun was merciless. My skin burned, my lips cracked, and my head throbbed from dehydration. I climbed back to the highest point on the island and stared out at the endless blue sea. That's when I saw it. A speck. Just a tiny dot on the horizon. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved, slowly, steadily. My heart leaped. A boat. A real boat. I scrambled down the hill, nearly tripping over tree roots and slipping on the sand. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I grabbed the tablecloth flag and raced to the beach, waving it above my head like a beacon. Help! Over here! Please! The yacht was large, sleek, far more luxurious than my father's. It stopped about 200 meters from shore. Then a small boat was lowered into the water. Two men rowed toward the beach. One was young, clearly a crew member. The other was a man I would never forget. Tall, sun-kissed skin, sharp, intelligent eyes. His presence was commanding even before he spoke. He stepped onto the sand and walked toward me with measured calm. "Are you all right?" he asked. I tried to answer, but my voice cracked. I was left here by my family." His gaze shifted, subtle but alert. He studied my appearance, the sunburn, the tangled hair, the desperation in my eyes. "Water," he said to his crewman. Moments later, I was drinking cool water from a bottle like it was the nectar of life. I could feel the strength returning to my body, slowly but surely. "My name is Nathaniel Blake," he said. "I own this island." I blinked at him. "You... what?" "Yes, it's private property. I sail by from time to time. No one's allowed here without permission. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw someone waving a tablecloth at me." Embarrassment flushed through me. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. My family, they said it was a joke, then they just left." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Let's talk more on the yacht. You need food, rest, and probably more than just one explanation." The yacht was a floating palace. Warm wood, cool marble, soft lighting. After a shower and clean clothes, I joined Nathaniel in the dining room, where a table was set with soup, fruit, and fresh bread. He didn't push. He just waited calmly as I recounted everything, starting with the picnic, the adventure my father called it, and ending with the moment their boat pulled away. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I broke when I said, I called out for them. I begged, and they laughed. Silence followed. Then Nathaniel spoke, voice low and cold. "That's not a joke, that's abandonment, and it's a criminal offence on private property." My heart pounded. "You mean I could press charges?" "You could, trespassing, reckless endangerment, but I doubt that's what you want." He was right. As angry as I was, I didn't want courtrooms or lawsuits. I wanted something deeper. I want them to understand what they've done. For once. I want them to see me. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I understand. I've been there." His voice changed, grew darker. "I once trusted someone like family, a business partner. He betrayed me, stole from me, left me for ruin. And the worst part? He smiled while doing it." I stared at him. Something shifted between us in that moment, not romance, not yet, but recognition. A shared scar. "I believe in justice," he said, "but not always through courts. Sometimes it's through understanding your own power." I leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted, but not from hunger or fear. From years of carrying invisibility on my shoulders. "I don't know what to do next," I whispered. Nathaniel looked me in the eyes. "Then let's start with this. Tell me who you really are, Claire, not who they say you are." And so I told him about my job, my projects, my investment analysis, about the deals I led, the profits I generated, the talent I never got credit for. As I spoke, I could feel something returning. My voice. He listened, fully, intently. Then he smiled, not out of pity, but respect. "You're not invisible," he said. "You're extraordinary. And I know exactly where your talents would be appreciated." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I want to offer you a position," he said, "in my corporate group. No pressure, but think about it. For the first time in days, maybe years, I felt something I hadn't felt in forever. Hope." The next morning, Nathaniel's yacht docked at Key West Harbor. I stood on deck, the Florida sun on my face, watching the shoreline draw closer. Only a few days ago I had left from this very spot, just another forgotten daughter being dragged along for a family vacation. Now I was returning with something I didn't even know I was missing. Clarity. Nathaniel joined me at the railing. "Have you made a decision?" he asked casually, but there was a glint of something more in his eyes. I nodded. Yes, I want the job. I want more than what I've let myself settle for. His smile was quiet, but warm. Good. My team in New York will be ready for you. You'll fit in perfectly. That night, alone in my hotel room, I looked at myself in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked stronger, steadier, new. I picked up my phone. After a long pause, I called the one number I had avoided since the island. My mother answered on the second ring. "Claire? Oh, thank God, are you all right?" Her voice sounded genuinely surprised, as if she didn't expect to ever hear from me again. "I'm fine, Mom," I said calmly. "I'm safe. Everyone's been worried sick. We thought something might have happened. Your father said—" "You left me there," I said, not angrily, just, truthfully. Silence. "That was your father's idea," she said defensively. "He thought you could use a little adventure." "It wasn't an adventure," I replied. "It was abandonment." "Oh, Claire, don't be so dramatic. We were planning to come back after a few hours, but the water got choppy." "That's not true. The weather was perfect." More silence. "I don't need you to explain," I said finally. "I just wanted you to know I'm okay. A friend stopped by the island. I was rescued. I've taken a new job in New York." "A job?" she repeated. "But what about your firm in Boston?" "I quit." "Claire, this isn't like you. I'm acting like someone who's finally taking control of her own life." I ended the call before she could say anything more. On Monday morning, I stepped into the glass tower that housed Blake International in New York City. The lobby was sleek and modern. The elevator whisked me to the top floor where Nathaniel greeted me with a firm handshake and a satisfied nod. "Welcome to your new beginning," he said. He wasn't exaggerating. Within weeks, I was leading strategy sessions, evaluating investment projects, and presenting my insights directly to senior executives. My reports were circulated across departments. My voice carried weight in meetings. For the first time, my work wasn't being ignored. It was respected. Nathaniel, true to his word, never treated me as a charity case. He challenged me, pushed me, expected results. And I delivered. At night, I would walk home through Manhattan, feeling the kind of exhaustion that didn't drain. It fulfilled. I was finally doing what I loved, in a place that saw me for what I was capable of, not who I was supposed to be in someone else's eyes. Then, one evening over dinner, Nathaniel said something unexpected. "I've been looking into your family's company." I blinked. "Bennett Development?" He nodded, slicing into his steak without looking up. At first, it was curiosity, but the deeper I dug, the more I found. Unpaid loans, risky expansions, overspending. It's worse than I thought. I leaned in, unsure how to feel. "So, it's all crumbling?" "Not yet, but it's teetering. The yacht your father bought, he used it as collateral for a bridge loan. That explained a lot. I've also been acquiring stock," Nathaniel continued, "quietly through a holding group. As of last week, I now control almost 40% of their shares." I stared at him. "You're taking over my family's company?" He met my gaze. I'm saving a business that's been mismanaged for years, but yes, your father will soon be reporting to someone else. Possibly even to you." The room spun slightly, not from wine, but from realization. "Is this revenge?" I whispered. Nathaniel's face softened. This is balance." I didn't speak for a while. Part of me felt guilt. Another part felt justified. They had left me behind like I was nothing. And now I was in a position where they would have no choice but to see me, not as a daughter to pity, but as a woman they had underestimated one time too many. Months passed, and my name started to appear in places it never had before: industry briefings, investment panels, even financial magazines. Claire Bennett, the strategic mind behind Blake International's expansion into emerging markets, was the headline of one feature. I didn't seek attention. I didn't post about it. But my family noticed. It began quietly. A message from my mother. "Saw your name in a newsletter today. You look beautiful in that photo." Then Tracy called. Her tone was uncharacteristically respectful. "Hey, Claire, I just wanted to say, wow, you've really made a name for yourself." And then came the inevitable. My father called. "Claire," he said, voice uncertain, even hesitant. "It's been a while. I heard you're doing well in New York." "I am," I replied flatly. "Very well, in fact." "Good, good," he said, but there was tension beneath his words. "Listen, I was wondering if we could talk about Bennett Development. There have been some changes." I already knew. Nathaniel had kept me updated. His quiet acquisition of shares had reached a point where he now had more influence in the company than my father. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then I asked, "Are you worried, Dad?" He paused. "I just think it's important we communicate." "Interesting," I said. "You never seemed interested in communicating when you left me stranded on an island." There was silence. Then, quietly, "Claire, I made a mistake." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because I needed the apology, but because I realized it didn't change a thing. Later that week, Nathaniel and I sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan. He sipped his wine, watching me thoughtfully. "Your family's company is on the edge," he said. "I've been invited to the next board meeting, and I think it's time you came with me." I raised an eyebrow. "As what?" "As a voice they can't ignore." The invitation to dinner came 2 days later. A family gathering, they called it. It was being held at an upscale Boston restaurant, the same one where they once celebrated Tracy's promotion and barely acknowledged my birthday. This time, things would be different. I arrived in a tailored black dress, heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. The maitre d' recognized my name and escorted me to a private dining room. My mother, father, and Tracy were already seated. They all stood up when they saw me. For the first time in years, they stood for me. "Claire!" my mother exclaimed, reaching out to hug me. I gave her a polite nod. Tracy smiled nervously. "You look amazing." "Thanks," I replied. "You too." My father cleared his throat. "Nathaniel hasn't arrived yet." "He'll be here soon," I said, taking my seat. The air was thick with unspoken things. Regret, uncertainty, maybe even fear. Then the door opened. Nathaniel walked in with his usual calm grace, greeted each of them with a courteous nod, then took the seat beside me. My father's face turned pale. "You," he whispered, "you're the one who's been buying our stock." Nathaniel looked him in the eyes and said, "Yes, and I'm also the man who rescued your daughter from the island you left her on." Silence. My mother covered her mouth. Tracy looked like she might faint. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. They were finally seeing me, not as a background character, not as someone who needed fixing or rescuing, but as a woman they had failed to recognize, and now had no choice but to respect. That night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole. Not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped needing them to validate me. Nathaniel raised his glass. "To new beginnings," we toasted, and I saw something in my father's eyes I had never seen before: humility. For the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't revenge. It was redemption. 3 years had passed since that unforgettable dinner in Boston. 3 years since I sat across from the very people who once left me behind, only this time, they had to look up to me. Bennett Development no longer belonged to the man who founded it. It had become part of the Blake International portfolio, streamlined, stabilized, and rebuilt under responsible leadership. Nathaniel had offered my father, Robert, a role, a modest project management position under oversight. Surprisingly, he accepted. And for the first time in his life, my father actually listened. He took feedback. He showed up on time. He worked. I reviewed the numbers from the Young Talent program, he told me one day, eyes lowered. You were right. It's working. I smiled. It's because we stopped trying to impress the wrong people and started investing in the right ones. Tracy, too, had changed. She'd left her high-powered law firm to join a non-profit legal aid centre. She now represented women in domestic violence cases and underserved communities. One evening, we grabbed coffee together. She looked tired, but lighter. I wish I had realised earlier, she said, what they did to you. What they did to both of us. In different ways. I didn't say much, just nodded. Sometimes, acknowledgement is more powerful than apology. But the biggest surprise came from my mother. Evelyn Bennett, once the queen of charity galas and private clubs, had become a certified family therapist. She now gave public talks on emotional neglect, generational pressure, and healing. At one of her lectures, I stood in the back of the auditorium as she said, "Real family isn't just blood. It's built. It's nurtured. And sometimes, it's the daughter you underestimated who teaches you how to love again." I don't think she knew I was there. But that night, I let myself believe, for the first time, that maybe she meant every word. As for me, I didn't become a CEO or a billionaire, but I did become something far greater myself. I had a team, a purpose, a life I built on my terms. And Nathaniel? He was still beside me. Not as a romantic partner, we never crossed that line, but as someone who saw my worth long before I fully saw it myself. One quiet evening in Manhattan, we stood on the balcony of his penthouse, wine glasses in hand, watching the city shimmer below. Funny, he said, how the darkest moments lead to the brightest awakenings. I nodded. That island. It felt like the end, but it was the beginning. Nathaniel turned to me. Would you go back and change it? I thought about it. The fear, the cold, the feeling of being discarded. And then, the fire, the clarity, the rise. No, I said. I wouldn't change a thing. A few weeks later, we hosted a small dinner, just the 5 of us. Me, Nathaniel, my parents, Tracy. There were no champagne toasts, no speeches, just quiet conversation, a few laughs and long silences where healing settled in. At the end of the meal, I stood and raised my glass. I used to think family was something you were born into, I said. Now I know real family is the people who bring out the best in you, who accept your flaws, celebrate your strengths, and never leave you behind on an island, literal or emotional. My mother's eyes shimmered with tears. My father nodded silently. Tracy reached out and gently touched my hand, and Nathaniel beside me said, "To the family we choose." Glasses clinked, and with it, a chapter closed. Not with vengeance, not with victory, but with clarity, with growth, with grace. Because sometimes, life's cruelest moment isn't a curse, it's an invitation to rise, to reclaim, and to finally become seen.